The morning mist clung to the jagged peaks of the Sierra Madre, oriental like ghostly fingers, concealing what would soon become one of the most decisive battlefields of the Mexican-American War. General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna stood atop Cerro Gordo, the towering hill that gave the battle its name. Surveying the narrow mountain pass below with the calculating eye of a seasoned warrior, it was April 17, 1847, and the Mexican commander believed he had chosen the perfect killing ground. Santa Anna's weathered hands gripped the brass telescope as he studied the treacherous terrain. The national road from Veracruz to Mexico City snaked through this bottleneck like a serpent trapped in stone, with steep cliffs rising on both sides. Any army attempting to pass would be forced into a narrow column, vulnerable to the devastating crossfire he had meticulously planned. 4,000 Mexican soldiers occupied carefully prepared positions along the heights, their artillery commanding every approach. The general's lips curved into a grim smile. This would be where the American invasion died. The Mexican positions were formidable by any measure. Cerro Gordo itself rose 800 feet above the road, its slopes bristling with cannon and entrenchments carved from the living rock. To the east, the hill called La Atalaya provided additional high ground, while the western approaches were guarded by nearly impassable ravines choked with thorny vegetation. Santa Anna had spent weeks preparing these defenses, drawing upon his experience from countless campaigns. He had fought the Spanish, the French, the Texans, and now the Americans, and he intended this mountain fortress to be their tomb. As referenced in the comprehensive accounts documented by the United States Army Center of Military History, the strategic importance of this position cannot be overstated in the context of the broader campaign. The American Army, under General Winfield Scott, had landed at Veracruz just weeks earlier, capturing the vital port after a brief siege. Now, they advanced inland toward the capital, following the same route that Hernán-Cortés had taken 3 centuries before. But Santa Anna had no intention of allowing history to repeat itself. The Mexican general's confidence was not without foundation. His army was well supplied, strongly positioned, and defending their homeland against foreign invaders. The soldiers under his command came from across the Republic, hardened veterans from campaigns in Texas and the northern states, alongside fresh recruits burning with patriotic fervor. They had transformed the rugged landscape into a fortress, hauling heavy guns up impossible slopes and carving firing positions from solid granite. Every boulder seemed to conceal a rifle barrel, every crevice a potential ambush. But Santa Anna's greatest advantage was the terrain itself. The pass at Cerro Gordo was nature's own killing field, a place where a smaller force could devastate a larger one through careful positioning and disciplined fire. The general had studied the approaches extensively, mapping every trail and identifying every weakness in any potential attack. The Americans would have to advance uphill under fire, across open ground, against prepared positions, a tactical nightmare that had broken armies throughout history. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist, Santa Anna felt the familiar surge of pre-battle anticipation coursing through his veins. He had gambled everything on this position, concentrating his forces here rather than conducting a fighting withdrawal toward the capital. Victory at Cerro Gordo would not merely stop the American advance, it would destroy their army entirely, potentially ending the war in Mexico's favor. The stakes could not be higher. Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna was ready to play his hand. General Winfield Scott's penetrating blue eyes studied the forbidding landscape through his field glasses, his jaw tightening as he absorbed the scope of the challenge before him. The 61-year-old commander, known throughout the army as Old Fuss and Feathers for his attention to military protocol and immaculate uniforms, had never faced a more daunting tactical problem. The Mexican position at Cerro Gordo appeared impregnable, natural fortress that seemed to mock his advancing columns. Scott's army of 10,000 men stretched back along the coastal road, as a serpentine column of blue uniforms, gleaming bayonets, and rumbling artillery that had marched inland from their victory at Veracruz. The men were in good spirits despite the grueling march through the tropical lowlands. where yellow fever and dysentery had claimed more casualties than Mexican bullets. They trusted their commanding general implicitly. Scott had never lost a battle, earning his reputation through decades of service from the War of 1812 to countless frontier campaigns. But now that legendary tactical genius faced its greatest test. The narrow pass ahead funneled his entire force into a killing ground where Santa Anna's artillery could slaughter them wholesale. A frontal assault up those steep slopes would be suicide, sending wave after wave of American soldiers into concentrated fire from prepared positions. Scott had not brought his army this far to see it, destroyed in a single afternoon of futile charges against impregnable heights. The general dismounted from his horse and gathered his senior officers around a hastily drawn map spread across. Wooden crate. Brigadier General David Twiggs, a grizzled veteran whose aggressive nature had earned him the nickname Old Davy, argued for an immediate frontal assault. "Give me my division in 6 hours," he growled, his scarred face flushed with anticipation. "We'll take those heights at bayonet point, just like we did at Monterey." But Scott shook his head, his strategic mind already working through alternatives. I'd not earned his reputation through reckless bravery, but through careful planning and innovative tactics. Somewhere in this maze of stone and thorns, there had to be a way to turn Santa Anna's strength against him. The Mexican general had chosen his position well, but every fortress had a weakness. Scott simply needed to find it. Captain Robert Lee of the Corps of Engineers stepped forward, his lean frame and thoughtful manner contrasting sharply with the bluff military bearing of the line officers. The young Virginian had been scouting the terrain for days, probing the Mexican defenses and mapping every trail through the mountains. General Lee said quietly, "I believe there may be another approach." As documented in the extensive military records preserved in the National Archives, Lee's reconnaissance would prove crucial to the battle's outcome. The future Confederate commander had discovered a narrow trail winding around the western flank of the Mexican position, threading through ravines and across precipitous slopes that Santa Anna had deemed impassable. It was a treacherous route that would test the endurance and courage of any troops attempting it, but it offered the tantalizing possibility of turning the entire Mexican position. Scott listened intently as Lee described his findings, occasionally asking pointed questions about the terrain and the time required for troop movements. The plan that began to form in the general's mind was audacious. While a portion of his force demonstrated against the Mexican front, the main attack would swing wide around their flank, climbing impossible slopes to strike where Santa Anna least expected it. It was the kind of bold maneuver that could win wars or destroy armies, depending on its execution. The American commander's decision would echo through history. Rather than batter his forces against the stone walls of Cerro Gordo, he would attempt to outflank the entire Mexican position through terrain so difficult that his enemy had left it unguarded. It was a gamble worthy of the stakes. Success would open the road to Mexico City, while failure would likely end the American campaign in catastrophic defeat. But Winfield Scott had built his career on calculated risks, and he was ready to stake everything on one more throw of the dice. The pre-dawn darkness of April 18th, 1847, provided perfect cover as Captain Robert Lee led the advance guard along the treacherous mountain trail he had discovered. Behind him stretched a column of nearly 4,000 American soldiers, their equipment muffled and their voices reduced to whispers as they began the most perilous march of the war. Each man understood that discovery would mean death, not just for themselves, but for the entire army trapped in the pass below. Lee moved with the fluid grace of a natural mountaineer, his engineering training evident in how he read the terrain and selected the safest routes through the maze of ravines and ridges. The trail was barely worthy of the name, more of a goat path that twisted and turned through landscapes that seemed designed to break both bodies and spirits. Loose shale shifted treacherously underfoot, while thorny vegetation tore at uniforms and exposed skin. The soldiers followed in single file, each man responsible for the safety of those behind him. Brigadier General Gideon Pillow's division formed the spearhead of this flanking movement, followed by the veteran regiments of General Twiggs. These were hardened troops who had proven their mettle in the siege of Veracruz. Men who understood that war demanded extraordinary sacrifices. They hauled their muskets and equipment up slopes that would challenge experienced mountaineers, their breath coming in ragged gasps as the altitude took its toll. Behind them came the artillery crews, somehow managing to drag their pieces along paths that seemed impossible for wheeled vehicles. The night hours crawled by with agonizing slowness as the column inched forward through the darkness. Every loose rock that clattered down the mountainside seemed loud enough to alert the entire Mexican army. While the occasional stumble or muffled curse sent ripples of tension through the ranks, Lee frequently called brief halts to allow the men to rest and close up their formation, his experienced eye gauging their endurance against the distance still to be covered. As the first hints of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, the American flanking force reached a critical waypoint, a narrow saddle between two peaks that would bring them within striking distance of the Mexican rear. Lee climbed to a rocky outcrop and raised his telescope, studying the enemy positions that spread out below him like a detailed map. The sight that greeted him exceeded his most optimistic hopes. The Mexican defenses faced entirely toward the main road, their artillery and entrenchments designed to repel a frontal assault from the east. Santa Anna's engineers had created formidable barriers against attack from that direction, but they had left their rear approaches virtually unguarded. A few sentries dozed at their posts, lulled by the apparent impossibility of any threat from this direction. The flanking maneuver had succeeded beyond all expectations. 4,000 American soldiers now poised to strike at the heart of the Mexican position, according to detailed battle reports filed with the War Department and preserved in military archives. The success of this flanking movement represented one of the war's most brilliant tactical achievements. Lee's reconnaissance and Scott's bold decision to attempt the seemingly impossible had placed the American army in position to achieve complete tactical surprise. The stage was now set for a coordinated assault that would catch Santa Anna's forces between hammer and anvil. But challenges remained. The American troops were exhausted from their night march, scattered along miles of treacherous trail, and would need time to form proper battle lines before attacking. Meanwhile, the main force under Scott's direct command prepared to launch their diversionary assault against the Mexican front, timing their advance to support the flanking attack. Success would require precise coordination across impossible terrain, with units separated by miles of mountain wilderness needing to strike simultaneously. Lee signaled for the column commanders to join him at the observation point, spreading his rough map across a flat stone as he briefed them on the assault plan. The objective was clear seize the heights of Cerro Gordo and Laya, cutting off the Mexican army's line of retreat while opening the road to Mexico City. But between intention and execution lay a chasm that had swallowed countless military plans throughout history. The next few hours would determine whether Scott's audacious gamble would be remembered as genius or folly. The morning of April 18th erupted in thunder and flame as General Scott's diversionary attack struck the eastern face of Cerro Gordo with devastating fury. Artillery batteries, carefully positioned during the pre-dawn hours, opened a concentrated bombardment that shattered the mountain silence and announced to both armies that the battle had begun. The Mexican defenders, startled from their positions by the sudden cannonade, rushed to their guns and began returning fire with equal ferocity. Colonel William Harney's 2nd Dragoons led the frontal assault, sabers gleaming in the morning sun as they spurred their horses up the rocky slopes. Behind them came waves of infantry, the 2nd Illinois and 14th Infantry Regiments, advancing with bayonets fixed and colors flying. The sight was magnificent, and terrible thousands of blue-uniformed soldiers surging upward against the stone fortress of Santa Anna's position, their battle cries echoing off the mountain walls. The Mexican response was immediate and devastating. Artillery pieces that had been hauled up impossible slopes during weeks of preparation now spoke with deadly authority, sending cannonballs crashing through the advancing American ranks. Musket fire erupted from concealed positions carved into the rock face, creating interlocking fields of death that no living thing could hope to cross unscathed. The frontal assault was proceeding exactly as Santa Anna had planned, exactly as Scott had intended. while the Mexican commander focused his attention and reserves on the dramatic attack developing to his front. Captain Lee's flanking force completed their final approach through the western ravines. The exhausted soldiers had been marching for nearly 8 hours through terrain that challenged every step, but now they could see their objective clearly. The heights of La Italia rose before them, occupied by a relatively small Mexican force that was already turning to watch the battle raging on Cerro Gordo. Brigadier General Pillow formed his men into attack columns, their officers checking weapons and adjusting formations with the calm professionalism of veteran soldiers. The plan called for a coordinated assault on multiple objectives. While Pillow's division struck La Italia, General Twiggs would swing further north to cut the road. Behind the Mexican position, success would require split-second timing and flawless execution. With units operating independently across miles of broken terrain, the signal came at exactly 7:30 in the morning. A rocket fired from Scott's position that burst in brilliant, red flames above the battlefield. Pillow's men rose from concealment and charged up the slopes of La Italia with a collective roar that seemed to shake the mountains themselves. The Mexican defenders, caught completely by surprise, managed only a few scattered volleys before the American assault swept over their positions like an avalanche, as documented in the official after-action reports compiled by the Army's Historical Division. The capture of La Italia represented a masterpiece of tactical coordination. The Mexican garrison, expecting no threat from this direction, had positioned their defenses to support the main fortifications on Cerro Gordo. When 4,000 American soldiers suddenly materialized from the impassable western approaches, the defenders found themselves facing attack from an entirely unexpected quarter. The psychological impact on the Mexican army was immediate and catastrophic. Soldiers who had felt secure behind their stone ramparts suddenly realized that their position was being turned, that enemy forces were striking at their rear while they were engaged to their front. Panic began to spread through the ranks as word of the American flanking attack raced from position to position. Santa Anna's carefully planned defensive battle was rapidly dissolving into chaos, but the Mexican general was not finished. A veteran of countless campaigns, he recognized the crisis and began shifting reserves to counter the new threat. Artillery pieces were hastily repositioned to bring fire to bear on the captured heights, while infantry regiments that had been held in reserve for a final counterattack were now committed to preventing complete collapse. The battle for Cerro Gordo was entering its most critical phase, both armies fully committed and no possibility of retreat. The next hour would determine not just the outcome of this engagement, but potentially the entire course of the Mexican-American War. General David Twiggs unleashed his division against the northern approaches of Cerro Gordo with the fury of a man who had waited 30 years for such a moment. The 60-year-old Georgia veteran, his white hair streaming beneath his campaign hat, led from the front as his regiment stormed up slopes that defied both gravity and common sense. Behind him surged the 3rd Artillery fighting as infantry. The 1st Artillery, the Rifles elite units whose marksmanship and discipline had been honed through years of frontier warfare. The Mexican defenders, already reeling from the surprise attack on La Italia, found themselves assaulted from yet another unexpected direction. Santa Anna's master plan was crumbling as American forces seemed to materialize from every quarter of the compass, striking at positions he had deemed secure. The general himself rode frantically between threatened sectors, his ornate uniform making him a conspicuous target as he attempted to rally his disorganized troops. Captain Lee, having successfully guided the flanking force to its objective, now found himself in the thick of the assault on Cerro Gordo itself. The young engineer officer had volunteered to lead a detachment of Virginia volunteers up a particularly treacherous approach, threading between Mexican strongpoints that were now firing in multiple directions. His detailed reconnaissance of the previous days proved invaluable as he guided the attackers through ravines and around obstacles that would have stopped less prepared forces. The fighting on the heights reached a savage intensity that tested the courage of veterans from both armies. Mexican soldiers, fighting for their homeland and their honor, stood to their guns even as American bayonets appeared among their positions. Artillery crews continued serving their pieces until overwhelmed by close combat, while infantry companies maintained disciplined volleys until forced into hand-to-hand fighting with clubbed muskets and steel blades. Lieutenant Pierre Beauregard, a young Louisiana Creole serving with the Corps of Engineers, distinguished himself by personally sighting the American artillery that had been dragged up impossible slopes during the night march. His precisely aimed guns began systematically destroying Mexican positions that had seemed invulnerable just hours before. The future Confederate general's performance at Cerro Gordo be remembered as one of the finest examples of artillery employment in the entire war. The tide of battle turned decisively when American forces seized the main Mexican battery. On Cerro Gordo itself, the capture of these guns, which had dominated the pass for weeks, sent shockwaves through Santa Anna's army that no amount of personal courage could overcome. Mexican soldiers began abandoning their positions in growing numbers, many casting aside their weapons as they sought escape routes through the mountain wilderness. According to comprehensive analyses preserved in the Smithsonian Institution's military collection, the American victory at Cerro Gordo represented one of the most complete tactical triumphs in the history of warfare. Santa Anna's army, which had seemed impregnable behind its mountain fortress, was not merely defeated but virtually destroyed as an organized fighting force. The careful defensive preparations that had taken weeks to complete were overrun, a matter of hours, by an enemy attack that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But victory came at a price. American casualties, while light compared to their Mexican opponents, still numbered in the hundreds. The frontal assault that had served as a diversion suffered particularly heavy losses, with entire companies decimated by the concentrated fire from prepared positions. The 2nd Illinois Infantry, which had charged repeatedly against the eastern face of Cerro Gordo, lost nearly half its strength in the bloody assault that fixed Mexican attention while the flanking movement developed. The most poignant moment of the battle came when American forces overran Santa Anna's personal headquarters. The Mexican general had barely escaped capture, leaving behind not only his personal effects, but also his ornate wooden leg prosthetic that had replaced the limb lost in the pastry war with France years earlier. This macabre trophy would become one of the war's most famous souvenirs, symbolizing the completeness of the American victory and the personal humiliation of Mexico's most celebrated military leader. As the sun reached its zenith over the conquered heights of Cerro Gordo, the transformation was complete. What had been an impregnable Mexican fortress at dawn was now firmly in American hands. Its guns turned toward the fleeing remnants of Santa Anna's army. The road to Mexico City lay open, defended only by the scattered survivors of what had once been the Republic's finest military force. The collapse of Santa Anna's army at Cerro Gordo unfolded with the terrible swiftness of an avalanche, transforming disciplined regiments into panicked mobs within minutes of the American breakthrough. Mexican soldiers who had fought courageously for hours suddenly found themselves cut off from their line of retreat, surrounded by enemy forces that seemed to appear from impossible directions. The psychological shock of seeing their impregnable position overrun shattered morale more completely than any artillery bombardment could have achieved. Santa Anna himself barely escaped the debacle, his ornate carriage abandoned as he fled on, horseback through mountain trails known only to local guides. The general who had proclaimed he would destroy the American invaders now found himself leading the remnants of a shattered army in headlong flight toward the interior. Behind him lay not only a devastating military defeat, but also personal humiliation that would haunt him for the remainder of his turbulent career. General Scott, observing the route from his command post on the newly captured heights, immediately ordered a pursuit that would maximize the psychological impact of victory. The American cavalry, held in reserve throughout the morning's fighting, now thundered down the national road in pursuit of the fleeing Mexicans. Captain Philip Kearny's dragoons led the chase, their sabers glinting in the afternoon sun as they cut down stragglers and captured supply wagons that had been abandoned in the panic. The spoils of victory exceeded even Scott's optimistic expectations. Mexican artillery pieces painfully hauled up the mountain slopes over weeks of preparation, fell into American hands along with thousands of small arms, tons of ammunition, and military supplies worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. More importantly, the road to Mexico City lay open, defended only by demoralized remnants incapable of organized resistance. Captain Robert Lee, his uniform torn and stained from the morning's fighting, supervised the systematic inventory of captured equipment. The young engineer who had made the victory possible through his reconnaissance now faced the prosaic task of cataloging the fruits of American success. His detailed reports would later document not only the material gains, but also the strategic implications of the triumph at Cerro Gordo. The human cost of the battle painted a stark picture of 19th century warfare's brutal arithmetic. Mexican casualties numbered in the thousands, killed, wounded, and captured in roughly equal proportions. Entire regiments had been destroyed as fighting units, their survivors scattered across the mountain wilderness. The cream of Santa Anna's officer corps lay dead on the contested heights, their bodies testament to the courage that had proven insufficient against superior tactics and overwhelming force. American losses, while significantly lighter still, represented a substantial sacrifice. The diversionary assault against the eastern face of Cerro Gordo had cost hundreds of casualties. Brave men who had knowingly advanced against impossible odds to ensure the success of the flanking movement, the Illinois and Indiana. Regiments that had borne the brunt of this attack would require months to rebuild their shattered ranks, as documented in the comprehensive military histories compiled by the War College. The Battle of Cerro Gordo marked the effective end of organized Mexican resistance in the field. Future engagements would be largely defensive affairs, with Mexican forces unable to mount the kind of coordinated offensive operations that Santa Anna had attempted at this mountain stronghold. The psychological impact of such a complete defeat would resonate throughout the remainder of the conflict. The immediate aftermath of victory brought its own challenges. Scott's army, while triumphant, remained deep in hostile territory with extended supply lines vulnerable to guerrilla attack. The general would need to consolidate his gains carefully, ensuring that tactical success translated into strategic advantage. The road to Mexico City was open. Capturing the enemy capital would require careful planning and continued aggressive action. Perhaps most significantly, the Battle of Cerro Gordo demonstrated the importance of innovative tactics and superior reconnaissance in overcoming seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Scott's willingness to attempt the impossible flanking movement, combined with Lee's detailed knowledge of the terrain, had transformed what appeared to be an impregnable position into a death trap for its defenders. The victory would be studied by military theorists for generations as an example of how tactical brilliance could overcome numerical and positional disadvantages. As evening fell over the conquered heights, American soldiers consolidated their positions while burial details began the grim task of interring the dead. The mountain fortress that had seemed so formidable at dawn now served as a monument to American arms, its captured guns pointing down the road toward Mexico City and the final campaigns that would end the war. The strategic implications of the American triumph at Cerro Gordo rippled outward from the mountain battlefield like expanding circles on a still pond, reshaping the entire character of the Mexican-American War. General Scott's audacious flanking maneuver had accomplished far more than capturing a single position. It had effectively ended Mexico's ability to conduct coordinated defensive operations and opened the path to the enemy capital. The psychological impact of such a complete defeat would influence Mexican military thinking for generations to come. President James Knox Polk, receiving news of the victory in Washington, recognized immediately that Scott's triumph had fundamentally altered the war's trajectory. The cautious advance that many had predicted would take years to reach Mexico City now seemed achievable within months. Congressional leaders who had questioned the wisdom of the entire campaign now competed to claim credit for supporting the general whose tactical genius had vindicated American arms so spectacularly for the Mexican nation. Cerro Gordo represented a catastrophe that extended far beyond military considerations. Santa Anna's reputation, built over decades of political and military maneuvering, lay in ruins alongside his shattered army. The general who had proclaimed himself the Napoleon of the West now faced the humiliating prospect of explaining how, An impregnable position had been overrun in a single morning by forces he had dismissed as inferior. Captain Robert Lee emerged from the battle as one of the war's most celebrated heroes. His reconnaissance and leadership during the flanking movement earning recognition throughout the American Army. The young Virginian's performance at Cerro, Gordo would be remembered as a masterpiece of military engineering, demonstrating how detailed terrain analysis could overcome seemingly impossible tactical challenges. His future as one of America's premier military commanders was effectively established on the heights of that Mexican mountain. The broader implications for American military doctrine were equally profound. Scott's victory demonstrated the continuing relevance of Napoleonic tactical principles when adapted to New World conditions, particularly the importance of maneuver and surprise in overcoming defensive advantages. Staff colleges would study the Cerro Gordo campaign for decades, using it to illustrate how innovative thinking could triumph over conventional wisdom. The human dimension of victory could not be overlooked amid the strategic celebrations. Thousands of Mexican soldiers lay buried in hastily dug graves on the contested slopes, their sacrifice acknowledged even by their enemies. American casualties, while proportionally lighter, represented real families destroyed and communities forever changed by the demands of national expansion. The price of manifest destiny was written in blood on the mountain heights, as recorded in the extensive documentation preserved by the Library of Congress. The Battle of Cerro Gordo stands as perhaps the most tactically brilliant engagement of the entire Mexican-American War. The combination of innovative reconnaissance, audacious planning, and flawless execution created a victory that military historians continue to study as an example of how superior leadership can overcome material disadvantages. Scott's willingness to attempt the seemingly impossible, supported by Lee's detailed terrain analysis, transformed a potential disaster into a triumph that opened the road to Mexico City. The immediate aftermath of victory saw Scott's army resume its advance toward the Mexican capital with renewed confidence and determination. The moral effect of Cerro Gordo extended far beyond the battlefield itself, influencing Mexican civilian morale and international perceptions of the conflict's likely outcome. European observers, initially skeptical of American military capabilities, now reassessed their estimates of the young republic's potential as a world power. The battle's legacy extended far beyond the immediate conflict, influencing American military thinking well into the 20th century. Officers who had participated in the flanking movement would carry lessons learned at Cerro Gordo into the Civil War and beyond, applying principles of maneuver warfare that traced their origins to that April morning in the Sierra Madre Oriental. The tactical innovations that had seemed so revolutionary in 1847 would become standard doctrine for future generations of American commanders. General Winfield Scott, already recognized as one of America's finest military minds, saw his reputation elevated to legendary status by the victory at Cerro Gordo. The old fuss and feathers, who had been criticized for excessive caution, now stood revealed as a commander, capable of breathtaking audacity when circumstances demanded it. His masterful combination of conventional and unconventional tactics had created a victory that would be remembered as long as Americans studied their military heritage. As the sun set on April 18, 1847, it illuminated not just a battlefield, but a transformed war. The mountain fortress that had promised to stop the American advance now served as a stepping stone toward Mexico City and ultimate victory. The courageous assault that changed the Mexican War was complete, its legacy destined to influence military thinking for generations to come.